Many great writers have hailed from the South. Walt Whitman, Margaret Mitchell, and Flannery O'Connor are a few of the great Southern literary figures. Another artist who is often overlooked is Sidney Lanier. Born in Macon, Georgia on February 3, 1842, Lanier was a great poet, musician, and writer. Sidney's parents were Robert and Mary Anderson Lanier. They were deeply religious and dedicated to the ways of the Old South. His father was a successful attorney who wanted Sidney to follow in his footsteps. However, Sidney was captivated by music. Lanier learned to play the flute, banjo, piano, violin, and the guitar at an early age. This interest in music stayed with Sidney throughout his life. Lanier was an 1860 graduate of Oglethorpe University. While enrolled at this prestigious school, Sidney achieved high honors. As a sophomore, Lanier encountered James Woodrow, a professor of science. It is Woodrow who is believed to be the one who introduced Lanier to scientific observation. This is thought to have molded Lanier's poetry. Philip Graham of the University of Texas writes, Lanier, on the other hand, believed that science and poetry are mutual helps, that science, through the senses, is to discover and tabulate facts, while art, through law and form, is to create from these facts its masterpieces. Graham, page 290. In 1861, the Civil War erupted. Sidney and his brother volunteered to serve in the Confederate Army. Calloway wrote in his book of Lanier's works, "The lecture room was now exchanged for the battlefield." Lanier Calloway, page 32. He and his brother passed up promotions in order to stay together as long as possible. After they were finally separated, Lanier was captured in Maryland and held prisoner of war in 1864. It was during this period that Lanier contracted tuberculosis, which haunted him for the rest of his life. 5 months later he was released and began the long journey to Georgia afoot. After the war, Lanier returned home to Georgia. In 1867 he married Mary Day. It was in this very same year that he published his first and only novel, Tiger Lilies. His novel was a war story that described the perils of the Civil War. The novel was not very successful, so Lanier turned his attention to music and poetry. Lanier had strong feelings opposing Reconstruction in the New South. Lanier favored an agrarian South over the industrialization that was going on in the North at the time. In 1866, Lanier wrote the poem Night and Day. Ed Parks of the University of Georgia said that Lanier thought of the war and Reconstruction as dark and night-like is amply indicated in his poems. Such light as existed he described as raven days of sorrow. Parks, page 117. This poem was written at the end of the Civil War when the South was in shambles. Sidney and Mary had 4 sons. His eldest, Charles Day, was born in Macon, Georgia on September 12, 1868. He was followed by the births of Sidney, Henry, and Robert. All of Lanier's sons were exceptionally knowledgeable and fond of the arts. Lanier held many jobs in order to support his family. He lived in poverty throughout much of his life. He taught for several years in many schools in various states. He finally achieved a position as principal of a school in Prattville, Alabama. The school closed only a year after Lanier was promoted because of the failing economy. Lanier then worked for 5 years at his father's law firm before moving to Baltimore. His father begged him to stay in the firm, but Sidney was too creative to find happiness in the law field. In Baltimore, he accepted first flutist chair in the Peabody Orchestra. According to the New Georgia Encyclopedia, as his focus shifted from poetry to music, with his acceptance of the Peabody Orchestra position, he composed his Danse des Moucherons, Midge Dance, in 1873 for the flute. GeorgiaEncyclopedia.org. His flute composition was highly successful, thus he gained the respect of the music lovers of the time. After his success with composing, Lanier once again tried to turn to poetry. In 1879, Lanier wrote one of his most famous poems, The Marshes of Glen. This religious work was written after Sidney paid a visit to the thick marsh in Brunswick County, Georgia. The poem tells of the discovery of God in nature. Robert Ross, in his critique of the poem, stated, Lanier was a nature poet without a consistent philosophy of nature. On the one hand, he tried to accommodate himself intellectually to the concept of nature as an amoral, impersonal force which was implied, he thought, by the discoveries of 19th-century science. But at the same time he was never quite able to cast off his inherent romantic belief in a sentient nature, the benign healer of man's torn spirit. Ross, page 404. Lanier published Corn in 1874. The poem describes a cornfield as if the stalks were soldiers on a battlefield, where they will soon die with dignity. Lanier was very productive in his poetry at that time. He followed Corn with the Song of the Chattahoochee, A Song of Love, and of course his most noted poem, The Marshes of Glen. Lanier attained great success as a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. During his failing health, the 20-lecture course was cut to 15. This lecture circuit was difficult for Lanier to endure. He was often carried on and off stage. He was so weak, his wife Mary had to pen most of the lecture scripts for him. Lanier finished the scripts and the lectures and then traveled to Lynn, North Carolina. He hoped that the climate would prove more favorable to his condition. Sadly, he passed away on September 7, 1881. Since his death, Lanier has been honored in many tributes throughout the United States. Countless schools in numerous states bear his namesake. Lanier's oak is marked as the oak under which Lanier sat and gazed upon the marshes in Glenn County, Georgia. There are two lakes named Lanier, one in Tyrone, North Carolina, and one in Gainesville, Georgia. The largest tribute to the poet is the Sidney Lanier Bridge. It is currently the longest bridge in Georgia and spans the South Brunswick River in Brunswick, Georgia.